Every parent's worst nightmare is losing their child in a crowded city. For 67-year-old Calvin Murphy, every day was a nightmare of being forgotten by that same city. The former construction foreman had built half the downtown skyline with his own hands, but now those weathered hands dug through trash cans for bottles and cans. Most people walked right past him like he didn't exist. But on this rainy Tuesday afternoon, as Calvin pushed his squeaky shopping cart past the courthouse, he spotted something that made his heart stop. A young girl, maybe 9 years old, lay unconscious on the wet pavement. She was alone, vulnerable, and needed help. Calvin's old instincts kicked in as he rushed toward her, not knowing this moment would change both their lives forever. What happens when a man the world has thrown away discovers he still has something precious to give? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Calvin Murphy woke before dawn, the way he had every morning for the past 3 years. The cardboard beneath him had softened from the overnight drizzle that found its way through the loading dock overhang where he slept. His shopping cart sat. Nearby, everything he owned in the world, secured with bungee cords and wrapped in plastic bags. He pulled the water-damaged photograph from his wallet, the edges soft with wear. Sarah smiled back at him, her arm around their daughter Jenny on graduation day. 22 years old in that picture, Jenny had been so proud of her nursing degree. That was before the accident, before the pills, before Calvin lost his job for missing too many days trying to help her through recovery. Before Sarah left, taking what remained of their savings, before everything fell apart like dominoes in a strong wind. Calvin tucked the photo away and stretched his stiff joints. 67 years of hard labor had left their mark. The herniated disc from the construction accident, the arthritis in his hands, the chronic pain that had started this whole downward spiral. But his mind remained sharp, even if the world had decided otherwise. The courthouse district came alive gradually around 6 in the morning. Calvin had learned the rhythms of this place over months of careful observation. The early joggers appeared. First, then the coffee shops opened their doors, filling the air with aromas that made his stomach clench with hunger. By 7, the lawyers and clerks would begin their purposeful march toward justice, briefcases in hand, minds already focused on their important work. Calvin understood the irony of living in the shadow of the courthouse. He had helped build this very building 15 years ago, when Meridian Construction still considered him their best foreman. His crew had poured the foundation, raised the walls, installed the marble facade that gleamed in the morning sun. Now, he collected aluminum cans from the trash bins outside, invisible to the people who worked within those walls he had helped create. His morning routine was precise, born of necessity and dignity. Calvin kept himself as clean as possible, using the public restrooms in the subway station 2 blocks away. He shaved every few days with a disposable razor, combed his grey hair, and wore his least stained shirt when he ventured into areas where people might actually see him. It was a small act of rebellion against the world's assumption that homeless meant worthless. The other regulars were stirring now. Martha emerged from her alcove behind the flower shop, her grocery cart loaded with bottles and cans she'd collected the night before. She nodded to Calvin. They weren't friends exactly, but they looked out for each other the way people do when they share the same invisible existence. "Storm coming?" Martha said, glancing at the grey clouds gathering overhead. She was maybe 50, with the weathered face of someone who had lived outdoors too long. Calvin didn't know her story, and she didn't know his. That was the unspoken rule of the streets. Your past belonged to you alone. Old Pete was already working his corner near the bank, his worn veteran's cap upturned for donations. Pete had been here longer than anyone, a fixture of the downtown landscape. He claimed to have served in Vietnam, though Calvin suspected the details changed depending on Pete's audience. It didn't matter. The man deserved respect for surviving this long on these unforgiving streets. Calvin's own corner was near the courthouse steps, where foot traffic was steady but not overwhelming. He wasn't a beggar. He had too much pride left for that. Instead, he offered small services. He'd watch someone's bike while they ran errands, help carry heavy boxes, or sweep sidewalks for the shop owners who'd let him. Most people hurried past without seeing him, but occasionally someone would drop $1 in his coffee can or buy him lunch from the corner deli. The faded construction badge clipped to his jacket had become a talisman. Calvin Murphy, site foreman, Meridian Construction. The laminated plastic was cracked and the photo faded, but it reminded him of who he used to be. On his worst days, when the pain was too much or the weather too cold, he'd touch that badge and remember the satisfaction of solving complex problems, of leading a crew, of creating something that would outlast his own life. Those had been good years. Calvin had started as a laborer, straight out of high school, working summers to pay for community college. He'd studied engineering at night while learning the trade during the day. By 30, he was running crews. By 40, he was Meridian's go-to foreman for their most challenging projects. He'd built schools and office buildings, hospitals and apartment complexes. He'd been proud of his work, proud of the calloused hands that could read blueprints and coax perfection from concrete and steel. The accident had changed everything. A crane malfunction during the construction of the Riverside Medical Center had sent a steel beam crashing toward his crew. Calvin had pushed 2 younger workers to safety, taking the crushing blow across his lower back. The newspapers had called him a hero. The company had called him a liability. The workers' compensation claim should have been straightforward. Calvin had been injured saving lives while doing his job, but Meridian's lawyers found ways to delay, to question, to cast doubt on the severity of his injuries. They claimed pre-existing conditions, suggested Calvin had been negligent, implied he was exaggerating his pain to avoid work. Month after month dragged by, while Calvin depleted his savings, paying for medical care and trying to keep his family afloat. Sarah had tried to be supportive, but the stress wore at their marriage like water on stone. She worked double shifts at the department store, while Calvin attended doctor appointments and physical therapy sessions that never quite brought him back to full strength. Jenny's addiction problems had started small, prescription painkillers, after dental surgery, but spiraled quickly into something darker. Calvin spent his days driving to rehab centers, bail bondsmen and court appearances, trying to save his daughter while his own world crumbled. When Meridian finally offered a settlement, it was barely enough to cover the medical bills they'd already accumulated. The company's lawyers made it clear this was their final offer: take it or face years more of legal battles, with no guarantee of a better outcome. Calvin had wanted to fight, but Sarah was exhausted, and they needed the money immediately. Jenny was in jail again, and they couldn't afford both her bail and their mortgage payment. Calvin signed the papers on a Friday afternoon in October. By Christmas, Sarah had left for her sister's house in Phoenix, taking their last $1,000 and leaving divorce papers on the kitchen table. By spring, the bank had foreclosed on their home. By summer, Calvin was living in his truck. By fall, even that was gone. The rain was starting now, fat drops that splashed against the courthouse steps and sent the morning commuters scurrying for cover. Calvin pulled his jacket tighter and steered his shopping cart toward the loading dock, where he could wait out the weather. He'd learned to read the sky like a farmer, knowing which clouds meant a quick shower and which promised hours of steady precipitation. But something made him stop. A flash of color on the courthouse steps caught his eye. Bright pink against the gray stone. Calvin squinted through the rain and felt his heart clench with recognition. It was a child's backpack, small and still, lying abandoned on the wet pavement. Calvin had seen enough of the world's cruelty to know that nothing good came of a child's belongings left alone in the rain. He'd learned to keep his head down, to avoid getting involved in other people's troubles. The streets had taught him that heroes ended up hurt, and he'd already sacrificed too much trying to save people who couldn't be saved. But something about that bright pink backpack called to him across the years, reminding him of Jenny's first. A day of school, of Sarah packing lunches with little notes tucked inside, of a time when protecting children was the most natural thing in the world. Calvin abandoned his shopping cart and walked toward the courthouse steps, his worn shoes splashing through puddles that reflected the grey sky above. As he got closer, he realized the backpack wasn't empty. There was a small form beside it, barely visible in the shadow of the courthouse columns. A child lay motionless on the cold stone, rain beginning to soak through her thin jacket. Calvin's training kicked in before his mind could process what he was seeing. 15 years of construction sites had taught him first aid, had drilled into him the protocols for emergency situations. He dropped to his knees beside the girl, his hands automatically checking for a pulse, while his eyes scanned for obvious injuries. She was young, 8 or 9 years old, with dark skin and braided hair that was beginning to mat with rain. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and Calvin felt the reassuring thrum of her heartbeat beneath his weathered fingers. No obvious trauma, no blood, but she was unconscious and alone in a storm. Calvin looked around desperately for help, but the rain had driven most people indoors. A few pedestrians hurried past under umbrellas, their heads down, their minds focused on getting to warm, dry places. No one else had noticed the small figure lying vulnerable on the courthouse steps. Without hesitation, Calvin shed his jacket and draped it over the child, using his own body to shield her from the rain. The cold immediately began seeping through his thin shirt, but he'd been colder, he'd been wetter, he'd been more uncomfortable than this countless times over the past 3 years. What he hadn't been was needed. Not like this. Not in a way that mattered. Calvin knelt on the cold courthouse steps, his jacket wrapped around the unconscious child while rain soaked through his thin shirt. The girl's breathing remained steady, but she showed no signs of waking. Her backpack lay beside them, bright pink with cartoon characters that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. A name tag sewn to the front read Ava in careful block letters. Ava, Calvin said softly, his voice gentle but urgent. Ava, can you hear me? Nothing. The rain was coming down harder now, and Calvin knew he needed help. He looked around frantically, but the morning commuters had all sought shelter. The courthouse wouldn't open for another hour, and the streets were nearly empty. Calvin's hands shook as he felt for his wallet, not for money, but for the business card Martha had given him months ago, a social worker who sometimes checked on the homeless population. But he realized with growing panic that what he really needed was an ambulance. This child required immediate medical attention, not the overwhelmed city services that might take hours to respond. He spotted a woman hurrying toward the courthouse entrance, her umbrella bent against the wind. "Excuse me," Calvin called out, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, I need help." The woman glanced over, took one look at Calvin's disheveled appearance and the unconscious child, and immediately pulled out her phone. But instead of calling for medical help, she stepped back and began dialing what Calvin realized was probably 911 to report a suspicious situation. "No, wait," Calvin said, raising his hands. "She's hurt. I found her like this. She needs an ambulance." The woman spoke rapidly into her phone, her words carried away by the wind, but Calvin caught enough to understand. She was reporting a homeless man with an unconscious child. The implication was clear, and Calvin felt a familiar stab of humiliation mixed with rage. In her eyes, he wasn't a good Samaritan, he was a threat. But Ava's welfare mattered more than his pride. Calvin pulled out his own phone, an ancient flip phone that barely held a charge, and dialed 911 himself. "Emergency services," came the crisp voice. "I need an ambulance at the courthouse steps on 5th and Main," Calvin said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "There's a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, unconscious. I don't know what happened to her, but she's breathing and has a pulse. Sir, what's your relationship to the child? Calvin hesitated. He knew how this would sound. I don't know her. I found her lying on the steps in the rain. Her name is Ava. It's on her backpack. Are you trained in first aid, sir? Yes, construction foreman for 15 years. I've kept her warm and dry, checked her vitals. She needs medical attention. An ambulance is on the way. Stay with the child and don't move her unless she's in immediate danger. Calvin closed the phone and looked down at Ava. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, but there was something fragile about her that went beyond her current unconscious state. She was thin, maybe too thin, and there were shadows under her eyes that suggested this wasn't a child who slept easily. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its sirens cutting through the sound of rain on concrete. 2 paramedics approached, a young woman with kind eyes and an older man who immediately assessed the situation with professional detachment. What happened here? The woman asked, kneeling beside Ava while her partner began unpacking equipment. I don't know, Calvin said, stepping back to give them room. I found her like this about 10 minutes ago. Unconscious, but breathing steady. Pulse is good, no obvious injuries. The male paramedic looked up at Calvin with barely concealed suspicion. And you are? Calvin Murphy. I was taking shelter from the rain when I saw her. Do you know this child? Never seen her before in my life. Her name's Ava. It's on the backpack there. The paramedics worked efficiently, checking Ava's vital signs and looking for signs of trauma or illness. The woman, her name tag read Jennifer, spoke gently to Ava while examining her, hoping to coax her back to consciousness. Ava, sweetheart, can you hear me? My name is Jennifer and I'm here to help you. For a moment, nothing. Then Ava's eyelids fluttered. She made a small sound like a kitten mewing, and her hand moved slightly. That's good, honey. You're safe. Can you open your eyes for me? Ava's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused. She looked around wildly until her gaze settled on Calvin, still standing nearby despite the rain soaking through his clothes. The man, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The nice man stayed with me. Jennifer glanced at Calvin with new interest. Is this man someone you know, Ava? Ava shook her head weakly. He kept me warm when I was scared. Calvin felt something tight in his chest loosen. The child's words were simple, but they carried a weight he hadn't expected. In her innocent view, he wasn't a threat or a burden. He was simply a person who had helped when she needed it most. A police car pulled up as the paramedics were preparing to transport Ava to the hospital. Calvin's heart sank. He knew how this conversation would go. Officer Martinez emerged from the vehicle, a middle-aged man with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much of the world's darkness. His partner, Officer Chen, was younger and more eager, her hand resting casually near her radio. What's the situation? Martinez asked Jennifer. 9-year-old girl, found unconscious. She's responsive now, but we need to get her to the hospital. For evaluation. Possible diabetic episode or seizure. And him? Martinez nodded toward Calvin. Claims he found her and called for help, Jennifer said, but her tone was neutral, professional. Calvin appreciated that she wasn't making assumptions. Martinez approached Calvin with the measured pace of experience. Sir, I need to ask you some questions. Calvin nodded. He'd been through this before, though never with stakes this high. I understand. How do you know the child? I don't. I was heading to that loading dock to get out of the rain when I saw her backpack on the steps. When I got closer, I realized she was unconscious. Why didn't you call for help immediately? I did. But first I made sure she was breathing and had a pulse. I used to be a construction foreman. I know first aid. Officer Chen stepped forward. Can you prove that? About being a foreman? Calvin reached slowly for his wallet, mindful that any sudden movements might be misinterpreted. He pulled out the faded construction badge and handed it to Martinez. Calvin Murphy, Meridian Construction, Martinez read aloud. He studied the badge, then Calvin's face, clearly trying to reconcile the professional in the photo with the homeless man in front of him. That was a long time ago. Calvin said quietly. From the ambulance, they could hear Ava asking for water and trying to sit up. Jennifer was explaining they needed to take her to the hospital, that her grandmother would meet them there. Her grandmother? Calvin asked. Martinez nodded. Judge Patricia Hamilton. The girl goes to school just a few blocks from here. Must have wandered off during lunch break. Calvin's eyebrows rose. Judge Hamilton was well known in the courthouse district, a respected jurist with a reputation for fairness and a sharp legal mind. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd found her granddaughter on the steps of the building where she dispensed. Justice, Mr. Murphy, Martinez said, handing back the construction badge. We appreciate what you did today. Not many people would have stopped to help. Calvin nodded, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to gratitude from law enforcement. Will she be all right? He asked, looking toward the ambulance. Kids are resilient, Jennifer said, approaching them as her partner loaded their equipment. Looks like low blood sugar, probably related to diabetes. Scary for her, but treatable. You did the right thing, keeping her warm and calling for help, as they prepared to leave. Ava called out from the ambulance. Where's the nice man? Calvin stepped closer. I'm right here, Ava. She looked at him solemnly, her small hand reaching out. Without thinking, Calvin took it gently in his own weathered fingers. Thank you, she said simply. Calvin felt tears prick his eyes. You're welcome, sweetheart. You feel better, okay? As the ambulance pulled away, Calvin stood alone on the courthouse steps, rain still falling around him. Officer Martinez approached him one more time. You might want to clean up and come by the hospital later, he said. I have a feeling the family will want to thank you properly. Calvin watched the ambulance disappear into traffic, red lights flashing through the rain. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he'd done something that mattered, something that reminded him of who he used to be, before the world convinced him he was nothing more than a problem to be ignored. St. Mary's Hospital bustled with the controlled chaos of a weekday morning. Calvin stood just inside the emergency entrance, water still dripping from his clothes, feeling every bit as out of place as he looked. The antiseptic smell mixed with anxiety and coffee created an atmosphere he remembered too well from his own medical ordeals 3 years earlier. Sir, can I help you? The receptionist's voice was polite but cautious. Her eyes took in Calvin's appearance, the wet, worn clothes, the unshaven face, the general air of someone who didn't belong in sterile, orderly places. I'm here about Ava Hamilton, the little girl who was brought in about an hour ago. I'm the one who found her. The woman's expression softened slightly. Oh, well, family members are with her now. Are you a relative? No, I just wanted to make sure she was okay. Before the receptionist could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the treatment rooms. Voices raised in worry and relief echoed down the hallway, the kind of sounds families make when fear transforms into gratitude. Ava, baby, are you all right? A woman's voice, tight with emotion. Grandma said you were at the courthouse. What were you doing there? A man's voice, stern but loving. Calvin moved away from the reception desk, not wanting to intrude, but unable to leave without knowing Ava was safe. He found a chair in the waiting area, far enough from the family drama unfolding nearby, but close. Enough to catch fragments of conversation. The paramedic said a man found you, a homeless man. That was the woman again, and Calvin could hear the complex mix of gratitude and concern in her voice. He was nice, Mama. He kept me warm when it was raining. Calvin closed his eyes, remembering Ava's small hand in his, the trust in her voice. When she thanked him, children saw the world differently than adults. They hadn't yet learned to categorize people by their appearance or circumstances. Marcus, we need to find this man. An older woman's voice, authoritative and clear. Whoever he is, he saved our baby. Calvin knew he should leave. This family had been through enough without having to deal with thanking the homeless man who'd stumbled into their crisis. But something kept him in that plastic chair, some need to see the story through to its conclusion. 20 minutes passed before they emerged from the treatment area. Calvin recognized them immediately, The tall man with graying temples had the bearing of a lawyer, confident and purposeful. The woman beside him moved with the grace of someone accustomed to professional settings, her concern for Ava evident in every gesture. But it was the elderly woman who commanded attention, even in her obvious distress. Judge Patricia Hamilton was smaller than Calvin had expected, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, and her dark eyes missed nothing as they swept the waiting room. "Excuse me," she said to the receptionist. "We're looking for the man who helped our granddaughter. He would have come in wet, probably not well dressed." The receptionist glanced toward Calvin, and he knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after sitting in the uncomfortable chair. "Ma'am," he said quietly, approaching the family, "I'm Calvin Murphy. I'm the one who found Ava." The man, Marcus, Calvin remembered from their earlier conversation, stepped protectively in front of his wife and mother-in-law. His lawyer instincts were clearly engaged, assessing potential threats. But Judge Hamilton moved around her son-in-law, studying Calvin's face with the intensity she usually reserved for complicated legal arguments. "You're the one who stayed with her in the rain," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to make sure she was all right before I left." "Sharon," Judge Hamilton said to the woman Calvin now knew was Ava's mother, "this is the man who saved our granddaughter." Sharon stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. The doctors said she could have been seriously hurt if she'd stayed out there much longer. Her blood sugar was dangerously low." Calvin nodded. "She's a brave little girl. How is she doing?" "Much better," Marcus said, his defensive posture relaxing slightly. "They've stabilized her blood sugar. She has type 1 diabetes. Usually manages it well, but sometimes—" He gestured helplessly. "Sometimes children are children," Judge Hamilton finished. "She's been having trouble adjusting to her new school. We think she skipped lunch and then got confused when her blood sugar dropped. The important thing is she's safe," Calvin said. "That's all that matters." There was an awkward silence as the family struggled with the social dynamics of the situation. Calvin could see them processing the contradiction. This bedraggled homeless man had performed an act of pure heroism, but he clearly existed in a world completely foreign to their own. "Mr. Murphy," Judge Hamilton said finally, "I'm Patricia Hamilton. This is my son-in-law, Marcus Thompson, and my daughter-in-law, Sharon. We owe you a tremendous debt." Calvin shook his head. "No debt, Mom. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Marcus said firmly. "They wouldn't have. I've seen enough of the world to know that most people would have walked past, assumed someone else would handle it." Before Calvin could respond, a small voice called from the treatment room doorway. "Grandma, is the nice man here?" Ava appeared. In the hallway, wearing a hospital gown that made her look even smaller than she had on the courthouse steps. Her face lit up when she saw Calvin. "You came to see me," she said, her voice stronger now that her blood sugar had stabilized. Calvin knelt down to her level, mindful of the family watching their interaction. "I wanted to make sure you were feeling better, much better. The doctors gave me juice and crackers. Do you want some? They have extra." The innocent offer, a child wanting to share her hospital snacks with a homeless man, created a moment of profound silence. Calvin saw Sharon wipe her eyes, watched Marcus's expression soften, and noticed Judge Hamilton studying him with renewed interest. "That's very kind of you, Ava, but I'm not hungry. I'm just glad you're okay. The doctor says I have to be more careful about eating lunch. Sometimes I forget when I'm reading." "Reading is important," Calvin said solemnly, "but taking care of yourself is important too." A nurse approached with discharge papers, breaking the spell of the moment. "Ava's ready to go home," she announced. "Just remember to monitor her blood sugar closely for the next few days." As the family prepared to leave, Judge Hamilton turned back to Calvin. "Mr. Murphy, would you join us for coffee? There's a cafe across the street. I'd like to speak with—" "You," Calvin hesitated. Coffee shops were another world. a place where his appearance would draw stares and whispers, but Ava was looking at him expectantly, and he found himself nodding. "I'd like that," he said, surprised to realize he meant it. 20 minutes later, they sat around a small table in Murphy's cafe, the irony of the name not lost on Calvin. He'd cleaned up as best he could in the hospital restroom, but he still felt conspicuous among the lunch crowd of professionals and hospital staff. Ava sat beside him, chattering about her school and her friends, completely oblivious to the social barriers that made the adults uncomfortable. She'd insisted on buying Calvin's coffee with her allowance money, counting out crumpled dollar bills with the seriousness of a Wall Street executive. "So, Mr. Murphy," Judge Hamilton said, stirring sugar into her coffee, "tell us about yourself. What's your story?" Calvin wrapped his hands around the warm coffee cup, feeling the heat seep through his weathered palms. The cafe was busy with the lunch crowd, and he was acutely aware of the glances from other patrons, some curious, others judgmental. But Ava sat beside him, coloring on her placemat with crayons the waitress had brought, completely comfortable with his presence. "My story isn't very interesting," Calvin said finally, answering Judge Hamilton's question. "I used to build things. Now I don't." "That's the shortest version I've ever heard," Marcus said with a slight smile. "As a lawyer, I appreciate brevity, but I suspect there's more to it." Calvin looked across the table at the family who had welcomed him into their crisis. Sharon watched him with gentle curiosity, Marcus with professional interest, and Judge Hamilton with the focused attention of someone accustomed to finding truth in complex testimony. "I was a construction foreman for Meridian Construction for 15 years, Calvin said slowly. "Worked my way up from day laborer, built a lot of buildings downtown, including the courthouse where I found Ava." "Really?" Ava looked up from her coloring. "You built where Grandma works?" "Part of it, yes. The foundation, the frame, some of the interior work." Judge Hamilton leaned forward. "I've been working in that building for 12 years. It's solid construction. Good work." "We always did good work," Calvin said, and for a moment his voice carried the pride of his former life. "What happened?" Sharon asked gently. Calvin hesitated. He'd told this story to social workers, to doctors, to the few people who'd cared enough to ask, but never to a family like this, never to people whose opinion somehow mattered to him. There was an accident, a crane malfunction at the Riverside Medical Center construction site. A steel beam was about to crush 2 of my workers. Calvin's voice became distant, remembering. "I pushed them out of the way, took the hit myself." "Were you hurt badly?" Ava asked. Her crayon paused mid-stroke. "My back was injured, herniated. Discs, nerve damage. I couldn't do construction work anymore." "But surely workers' compensation covered that," Marcus said, his legal mind engaging. "You were injured on the job, saving lives." Calvin's laugh was bitter, should have been straightforward. But Meridian's lawyers found ways to delay and question everything. They claimed pre-existing conditions, suggested I was faking the severity. The case dragged on for 2 years. "That's unconscionable," Judge Hamilton said sharply. "While I was fighting for compensation, my daughter Jenny got into trouble with prescription drugs. Started with pain pills after dental surgery, became something worse. My wife Sarah was working double shifts to keep us afloat. I was spending my days in courtrooms and rehab centers and doctors' offices, trying to hold everything together." Calvin paused, looking down at his coffee. The memories were still painful. Even after 3 years, the settlement Meridian, finally, offered was barely enough to cover the medical bills we'd already accumulated. Sarah wanted to take it. She was exhausted, we were broke, and Jenny needed bail money again. I wanted to fight, but, he shrugged, sometimes you have to choose between being right and surviving. "So you took the settlement," Sharon said softly. "I took it. Sarah left anyway, moved to Phoenix with her sister, said she couldn't watch me destroy myself trying to save people who didn't want to be saved. The house went into foreclosure 6 months later. "And your daughter?" Judge Hamilton asked. Jenny's in rehab in California, 3rd time. We don't talk much anymore. Calvin's voice was flat, matter of fact. She blames me for a lot of things. Maybe she's right. The table fell silent. Ava had stopped coloring and was looking at Calvin with the serious expression children get when they encounter sadness they don't fully understand. That's not fair, she said finally. You were helping people. That's what heroes do. Calvin's throat tightened. I'm not a hero, sweetheart. Heroes don't end up living under loading docks. Yes, you are, Ava insisted. You helped those workers. You helped me. Grandma says heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Sharon reached across the table and squeezed Calvin's hand briefly. She's right, you know. What you've been through, that's not failure. That's a system failing you. The important thing, Marcus said, is what you do now. You could have walked past Ava this morning. You could have assumed someone else would help her, but you didn't. Judge Hamilton had been quiet during Calvin's story, but now she spoke with the authority of someone who had seen injustice from both sides of the bench. Mr. Murphy, in 30 years on the bench, I've learned to recognize character. It's not about what someone owns or where they live. It's about what they do when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain and everything to lose. I didn't have anything left to lose, Calvin said. That's where you're wrong, she replied. You could have lost your humanity. You could have become bitter enough to walk past a child in need. The fact that you didn't, that tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Ava had returned to her coloring, but Calvin noticed she was drawing something new on the back of her placemat. When she finished, she turned it toward him. This is you, she announced proudly. Calvin stared at the crayon drawing. It showed a tall figure in what might have been a cape, standing protectively over a much smaller figure. Above the scene, Ava had written in careful block letters, "My Guardian Angel." Guardian is spelled Guardian, Marcus said gently, the teacher in him automatically correcting. I know, Ava said matter-of-factly, but I like it better my way. Calvin felt tears threatening again. No one had drawn him a picture in years, not since Jenny was small and would bring home artwork from school, proudly displaying refrigerator masterpieces of stick figures and crayon rainbows. Can I keep this? He asked. Of course. I made it for you. Calvin folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket next to the faded photograph of his own family. 2 pictures now, one of who he used to be, one of who he might still become. Mr. Murphy, Judge Hamilton said as they prepared to leave, I'd like to stay in touch. Would that be all right with you? Calvin nodded, not trusting his voice. Grandma, Ava said as they stood up, can Mr. Calvin come to dinner sometime? I want to show him my room and my books. Judge Hamilton exchanged glances with Marcus and Sharon. Calvin saw the silent communication pass between them, the careful consideration of boundaries, safety, and social expectations. We'll see, sweetheart. Judge Hamilton said diplomatically, Mr. Calvin has his own life to live. But Calvin caught the look in her eyes, the same evaluating expression she'd worn in the hospital. He had the distinct impression that Judge Patricia Hamilton was a woman who made decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions. And the evidence of the morning had apparently weighed in his favor. As they parted ways outside the cafe, Ava hugged Calvin's legs with the fierce affection only children can muster. Thank you for taking care of me, she whispered. Calvin knelt down and hugged her back, breathing in the scent of hospital soap and childhood innocence. Thank you for taking care of me too, he whispered back. Walking back toward his makeshift shelter, Calvin felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone waiting for circumstances to change, but the quiet confidence that comes from remembering you're still capable of making a difference. The rain had stopped, and late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps where everything had changed. Calvin touched the drawing in his pocket and allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst part of his story was finally over. 3 days passed before Calvin saw the Hamilton family again. He'd returned to his routine, collecting cans, avoiding the more aggressive panhandlers, and spending his evenings whittling small figures from scrap wood he found at construction sites. It was a skill he'd learned from his grandfather years ago, a way to keep his hands busy when his mind wandered to dark places. He'd been working on a small bird, trying to capture the delicate curve of its wing, when Ava appeared beside his shopping cart. She moved with the quiet determination of a child on a mission, her bright pink backpack bouncing as she approached. "Mr. Calvin!" she called out, causing several pedestrians to turn and stare. "I found you!" Calvin quickly stood, scanning the area for her family. "Ava, sweetheart, where are your parents?" "Mama's in that coffee shop." She pointed to Murphy's cafe across the street. "Talking to Daddy on the phone about boring lawyer stuff. I saw you through the window." Calvin felt a familiar surge of protective instinct. "You can't just run across the street by yourself. Your family will be worried." "I looked both ways," Ava said seriously, "and I wanted to give you this." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Calvin accepted it carefully, aware that whatever a 9-year-old considered worthy of gift wrapping was probably precious to her. Inside was a hand-carved wooden bird, painted in bright blues and yellows. The craftsmanship was clearly adult, professional, even, but the color choices screamed childhood joy. "Daddy helped me make it," Ava explained proudly, "but I did all the painting myself. I remembered you like birds because of that one you were making when I found you yesterday." Calvin turned the bird over in his hands, marveling at the smooth finish and delicate details. "This is beautiful, Ava. Your father is very talented. He used to make things when he was little, before he became a lawyer. Grandpa taught him. But he doesn't do it much anymore because he's always working." Ava paused thoughtfully. "Maybe you could teach me. I asked Daddy, but he said he doesn't remember how." Before Calvin could respond, Sharon appeared at his side, slightly breathless, from hurrying across the street. "Ava Marie Thompson, you cannot run off like that," she scolded gently. Then to Calvin, "I'm sorry, she spotted you and took off before I could stop her." "No harm done," Calvin said. "She was just showing me this beautiful bird." Sharon's expression softened as she looked at the painted wooden figure in Calvin's hands. "Marcus stayed up until midnight working on that. I haven't seen him touch his woodworking tools in years." "It's lovely," Calvin said sincerely. "Both of you did wonderful work." An awkward silence stretched between them. Calvin could sense Sharon's internal struggle, gratitude warring with social expectations, kindness competing with caution. "Mr. Murphy," she said finally, "would you like to join us for coffee? Marcus should be finished with his call soon." Calvin hesitated. He'd cleaned himself up as much as possible after Ava's visit, but he was still acutely aware of how he must appear to other cafe customers. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Sharon said firmly. "Ava's been asking about you constantly. She wants to know where you live, what you eat for breakfast, whether you get cold at night. She's worried about you." Calvin looked down at Ava, who was nodding enthusiastically. "I told Mama you probably don't have a warm bed like mine. That's not fair." The matter-of-fact way she stated this injustice hit Calvin harder than any adult sympathy could have. Children saw the world in such clear terms, fair and unfair, kind and mean, right and wrong. "Life isn't always fair, sweetheart," Calvin said, gently. "But good people try to make it more fair when they can. Like you did when you helped me," Ava said. "Like you're doing now, bringing me this beautiful bird." They crossed the street together, Ava chattering about her school and her friends, completely oblivious to the curious stares of other pedestrians. Sharon walked beside them, and Calvin noticed how she subtly positioned herself between him and her daughter. Not out of mistrust, he realized, but from the protective instincts of any parent in an unusual situation. Marcus was waiting at their usual table, his phone finally put away. He stood as they approached, extending his hand to Calvin with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to meeting people from all walks of life. Mr. Murphy, I'm glad you could join us. Ava's been planning this reunion since yesterday. They settled into their seats, and Calvin noticed how naturally the family included him in their conversation. Marcus asked about his woodworking. Sharon inquired about his health, and Ava peppered him with questions about construction work. "Did you really build Grandma's courthouse?" she asked, her eyes wide with fascination. "I helped build it," Calvin corrected. "It takes lots of people to construct a building like that. Architects to design it, engineers to make sure it's safe, dozens of workers with different skills. What was your favorite part?" Calvin considered the question seriously. "The foundation. Maybe you can't see it once the building is finished, but everything depends on it being solid. If the foundation isn't right, nothing else matters." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good metaphor for a lot of things." "Daddy, what's a metaphor?" Ava asked. "It's when you use one thing to explain something else," Sharon said. "Like when Mr. Calvin talks about building foundations. He might also be talking about how people need solid foundations too. Family, friends, good values." "Oh," Ava said, processing this. "So when Grandma says I need to build good study habits, that's like building a foundation for learning?" "Exactly," Calvin said, impressed by her quick understanding. The conversation flowed naturally from there. Stories about construction projects, Ava's school adventures, Marcus's legal cases, carefully sanitized for young ears, and Sharon's work as a pediatric nurse. Calvin found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't experienced since before his accident. "Mr. Calvin," Ava said as they prepared to leave, "do you know how to carve animals? I really want to learn." Calvin looked at Marcus and Sharon, unsure how to navigate this request. The longing in the child's voice was clear, but he didn't want to overstep boundaries. "I know a little bit," he said carefully, "but your father is much better at woodworking than I am." "I'm rusty," Marcus admitted. "It's been years since I've done any serious carving. Maybe," he paused, glancing at his wife, "maybe we could arrange something, if you'd be willing to give Ava some basic lessons." Calvin felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name. Purpose, maybe, or the simple pleasure of having skills. Someone valued. "I'd be honored," he said. The Hamilton family's home in the historic Riverside district was everything Calvin had expected. Elegant without being ostentatious, comfortable without being extravagant. The kind of house that suggested success earned through hard work rather than inherited privilege. Calvin stood on the front porch, his old tool belt slung over his shoulder, feeling like he was crossing into a different world. Judge Hamilton answered the door herself, dressed casually in slacks and a cardigan that made her seem more approachable than she had in the hospital. Her eyes took in the tool belt with interest. "Mr. Murphy, I'm so glad you could come. Ava's been practically vibrating with excitement since Marcus called you yesterday." "I appreciate you having me, Mom. I brought some basic carving tools and wood scraps that should be good for a beginner. Please call me Patricia, and thank you for taking time to do this. Ava needs more adults in her life who understand the value of working with your hands." She led him through the house, and Calvin couldn't help but notice the family photographs lining the hallways, graduations, vacations, holiday gatherings. The visual history of a family that had stayed together, that had built something lasting. "This is beautiful," he said, pausing at a photo of a much younger Patricia in her judge's robes, flanked by Marcus and Sharon at what appeared to be her swearing-in ceremony. "That was 12 years ago," Patricia said. "The day I achieved my life's goal of becoming a federal judge. I thought that was the most important thing I'd ever accomplish. And now," Patricia smiled, an expression that transformed her austere features. "Now I know the most important thing I ever did was help raise that little girl who's probably wearing a hole in the back patio waiting for you." They found Ava in the backyard, sitting at a picnic table with several pieces of wood laid out in neat rows. She'd organized the workspace with the precision of a surgeon, and Calvin recognized the obsessive attention to detail that often accompanied both high intelligence and mild anxiety. "Mr. Calvin, I got everything ready," Mama, help me put newspapers down so we don't make a mess. Marcus emerged from the house carrying a cooler of drinks and a first aid kit. I figured we should be prepared, he explained, with a slightly embarrassed grin. Sharon's nurse instincts kicked in when she heard we'd be working with sharp tools. Calvin set down his tool belt and examined Ava's preparations. This looks perfect. You've got good organizational skills. That's important for any kind of craftsmanship. For the next hour, Calvin guided Ava through the basics of wood carving. He showed her how to hold the knife safely, how to read the grain of the wood, how to make shallow cuts that would gradually shape the material into something recognizable. The secret, he explained as they worked on a simple fish shape, is patience. You can't force the wood to become something it doesn't want to be. You have to work with it, respect it. Like people, Ava asked, concentrating intently on her. In careful cuts. Calvin paused, struck by the insight. Yes, like people. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from understanding what's already there, not trying to impose your will on something. Marcus had pulled up a chair to watch, and Calvin noticed him unconsciously mimicking the hand movements as he demonstrated techniques. You know, Marcus said, I'd forgotten how meditative this could be. My father used to say carving was like prayer. It quieted the mind. Your father was a wise man, Calvin replied. What did he like to carve? Birds, mostly. We have some of his pieces in the house. Maybe I'll show you later. As Ava worked, Calvin found himself sharing stories from his construction days. Not the bitter ending, but the satisfying middle years when he'd been good at his job and proud of his work. He told her about the satisfaction of seeing a building rise from nothing, about the teamwork required to complete complex projects, about the way a well-built structure could serve a community for generations. Did you always want to build things? Ava asked, taking a break to examine her progress. I think so. Even as a kid, I was always taking things apart to see how they worked, then trying to put them back together better than before. That's what I do with books, Ava said seriously. I take apart the stories in my head and try to understand why the author made certain choices. Calvin looked at this remarkable child, wise beyond her years, curious about everything, gifted with the kind of analytical mind that would take her far in life if properly nurtured. That's a very sophisticated way to think about reading, he said. Have you ever thought about trying to write your own stories? Sometimes, but I'm not very good at it yet. Well, writing is like carving. It takes practice and patience. You start with rough shapes and gradually refine them until they become what you intended. Patricia appeared on the patio with a tray of sandwiches and lemonade. I thought you might be getting hungry. How's the lesson going? Look, Grandma! Ava held up her carving, a recognizable fish complete with scales Calvin had helped her score into the wood. Mr. Calvin says I have natural talent. It's beautiful, sweetheart. You should be proud of that work. As they ate lunch, Calvin found himself drawn into a conversation about education, community involvement, and social responsibility. The Hamilton family, he realized, were people who thought deeply about their role in the world, who used their privileges and positions to try to make things better for others. The problem with homelessness, Patricia was saying, isn't just the lack of housing. It's the systematic erosion of dignity, the way society teaches people to become invisible to themselves as well as others. Calvin nodded, thinking of Martha, and old Pete, and the dozen other people who shared his invisible existence. It's easy to lose track of who you used to be when everyone treats you like you never existed in the first place. But you didn't, Ava said matter-of-factly. You still knew how to help people. You still knew how to carve. You still knew how to be nice to kids. The simple observations silenced the adults. Out of the mouths of babes, Calvin thought. She's right, Marcus said finally. Whatever else you've lost, you haven't lost the essential parts of yourself. Calvin felt something shift inside him, a tiny crack in the armor of resignation he'd built around his heart. For 3 years, he'd believed that his circumstances had fundamentally changed who he was. But maybe, Just maybe Ava was right. Maybe the core of who he'd always been was still there, just buried under layers of disappointment and survival. As the afternoon wound down, Calvin packed up his tools, while Ava carefully wrapped her carved fish in tissue paper. "Can we do this again?" she asked hopefully. Calvin looked at Patricia, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that very much," he said. Walking back toward downtown as evening approached, Calvin carried something more valuable than the leftover sandwiches Patricia had insisted he take. He carried the memory of being useful again, of having knowledge and skills that mattered to someone. For the first time in years, he was beginning to remember not just who he used to be, but who he still might become. Judge Patricia Hamilton's chambers reflected 30 years of careful legal scholarship. Law books lined every wall, case files organized in precise stacks, and a computer screen displaying research that most lawyers would find impenetrable. But tonight, she wasn't reviewing judicial opinions or preparing for court arguments. She was investigating Calvin Murphy. It had started as simple curiosity. The man who'd saved her granddaughter clearly had depth and intelligence that his circumstances obscured. His knowledge of construction, his gentle way with Ava, his obvious education, none of it fit the stereotype of chronic homelessness. Patricia had learned to trust her instincts about people, and her instincts told her there was more to Calvin's story than a construction accident and family dissolution. She'd started with public records, an old habit from her prosecutorial days. Calvin's legal name appeared in dozens of documents spanning decades. Property records, business licenses, court filings, and newspaper articles painted the picture of a man who'd once been deeply embedded in the civic life of the city. Her surprise was a newspaper clipping from 1998, "Local Foreman Honored for Safety Innovation." The article described how Calvin Murphy had developed a new securing system for high-rise construction that had been adopted by contractors throughout the state. The accompanying photo showed a younger Calvin accepting an award from the mayor, his face bright with professional pride. More research revealed additional commendations. Calvin had served on the city's Construction Safety Board, had been featured in trade publications, and had testified before the state legislature on worker protection standards. This wasn't just any construction worker. This was a man who had been a leader in his field, someone whose expertise had literally saved lives. But it was the next set of documents that made Patricia's hands shake with anger. The workers' compensation case files told a story of systematic corporate malfeasance. Meridian Construction hadn't just delayed Calvin's claim. They had actively worked to destroy his reputation and credibility. Internal company memos, obtained through discovery proceedings, revealed a deliberate strategy to discredit injured workers by questioning their competence, their sobriety, and their motivation. Calvin's case was particularly egregious. Despite having the most exemplary safety record in the company's history, despite having just saved 2 men's lives, Meridian's lawyers had painted him as a reckless employee who had caused his own injury through negligence. They'd hired private investigators to follow him, hoping to catch him engaged in physical activity that would contradict his disability claims. They'd questioned his co-workers, suggesting that anyone who supported Calvin's version of events might find their own jobs in jeopardy. The legal strategy had worked. Facing mounting legal bills and a family in crisis, Calvin had accepted a settlement that barely covered his medical expenses. What the public records didn't show, but Patricia could infer from the timeline, was the human cost of this corporate cruelty. But the most damning document was one Patricia almost missed, a small notation in a supplemental filing that referenced irregularities in crane maintenance records. Her prosecutor's instincts engaged immediately. She spent the next 2 hours tracking down inspection reports, maintenance logs, and safety compliance documents. What she found was evidence of a criminal conspiracy. Meridian Construction had been falsifying crane inspection records for years, deferring expensive maintenance while certifying the equipment as safe. The crane that had malfunctioned and nearly killed Calvin's crew had been operating with known defects. Defects the company had covered up to avoid work delays and cost overruns. Calvin hadn't just been injured in a workplace accident. He'd been the victim of corporate negligence so severe it bordered on attempted manslaughter. And when he'd tried to seek rightful compensation, the same company had systematically destroyed his life to protect their profits. Patricia leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the injustice. As a federal judge, she'd seen plenty of corporate wrongdoing, but this felt personal. This company had stolen everything from a good man: his career, his family, his home, his sense of self-worth, and then convinced him he was somehow to blame for their crimes. The worst part was the timing. Calvin's case had been settled just months before a major class action lawsuit exposed Meridian's pattern of safety violations and cover-ups. Other injured workers had eventually received substantial settlements, and criminal charges had been filed against company executives. But Calvin, worn down by 2 years of legal warfare, had settled too early to benefit from the later revelations. Patricia picked up her phone and dialed Marcus's number. "Mom," Marcus answered immediately. "It's almost midnight. Is everything okay? I need you to come to my chambers immediately and bring Sharon if she's awake." "What's wrong?" "I've been researching Calvin Murphy's background. What I've found, Marcus, this man was robbed of everything he had, and I think we're the only people positioned to do something about it." An hour later, Marcus and Sharon sat across from Patricia's desk, reading through the documents she'd compiled. Sharon was the first to speak. "This is monstrous. They knew the crane was defective and they let workers use it anyway." "It gets worse," Patricia said grimly. "Look at this internal memo from 3 days after Calvin's accident." Marcus read aloud. "Murphy incident presents liability exposure. Recommend aggressive defense strategy to minimize payout and discourage similar claims." He looked up. They weren't just covering up negligence. They were using Calvin as an example to intimidate other potential claimants. "A good man's life was destroyed to protect corporate profits," Patricia said, "and it worked. The company avoided accountability until it was too late for Calvin to benefit from the truth." Sharon was studying the medical records Patricia had obtained. The extent of his injuries. He should never have been able to work construction again. But he was still supporting his daughter's addiction treatment, fighting the compensation case, trying to hold his family together. The stress alone would have been overwhelming. "So what do we do?" Marcus asked. Patricia had been thinking about this for hours. Legally, Calvin's settlement included a non-disclosure agreement and release of claims. Normally, that would end the matter. But there are exceptions when fraud is involved. "You think we can reopen the case?" "I think Calvin Murphy deserves to know the truth about what happened to him. And I think he deserves the chance to decide whether he wants to seek justice." Marcus was already thinking like a lawyer. "The statute of limitations on fraud claims is longer than for standard workplace injury. And if we can prove the company concealed evidence, we'd need Calvin's cooperation," Sharon interjected. "This would mean reliving everything he's been through, facing the legal system that already failed him once." Patricia nodded. "Which is why we need to approach this carefully. Calvin has every reason to distrust lawyers and judges. He's been betrayed by the system before. But he trusts us," Sharon said quietly. "Or at least he's beginning to. After what he did for Ava, after the time he spent with our family, he might listen to us when he wouldn't listen to anyone else." "There's something else," Patricia said, pulling out one final document. "The courthouse Calvin helped build. I've been working there for 12 years, making decisions that affect people's lives, dispensing justice from a building constructed with the sweat and skill of a man who was denied justice himself. That feels like something more than coincidence." Marcus studied his mother-in-law's face. "You feel responsible." "I feel called to action," Patricia corrected. "Calvin Murphy saved our daughter in more ways than one. Maybe it's time we returned the favor." The three of them sat in contemplative silence, each processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Finally, Sharon spoke. How do we tell him? How do we explain that everything he's believed about his own situation has been a lie constructed by people who stole his life? Very carefully, Patricia said, and with the understanding that this information might be harder for him to bear than the ignorance he's been living with. Or, Marcus said thoughtfully, it might be exactly what he needs to reclaim his sense of self-worth. Calvin's been carrying the weight of believing he somehow deserved what happened to him. Learning the truth might be painful, but it could also be liberating. Patricia began gathering the documents into a secure folder. There's a Chinese proverb. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. We can't give Calvin back the 20 years he lost, but we might be able to give him a different future. When do we approach him? Sharon asked. Patricia looked out her window at the courthouse steps where Calvin had found Ava, where this entire sequence of events had begun. Soon, she said. But first, we need to make sure we're prepared to see this through to the end. If we're going to ask Calvin to fight this battle, we'd better be ready to fight it with him. Calvin was whittling a small elephant for Ava when Patricia Hamilton found him on the courthouse steps 3 days later. The irony of the location wasn't lost on either of them. He sat where he'd first encountered her granddaughter, surrounded by the building he'd helped construct, about to learn truths that would reshape everything he thought he knew about his life. Mr. Murphy, Patricia said, settling beside him on the stone steps with the careful dignity of someone unaccustomed to sitting outdoors. We need to talk. Calvin looked up from his carving, noting the manila folder in her hands and the serious expression on her face. This sounds official. Am I in some kind of trouble? No, but I've discovered that you were the victim of a much greater injustice than any of us realized. Patricia opened the folder and pulled out the first document, the newspaper clipping from 1998. I've been researching your background. Calvin accepted the clipping, his eyes widening as he recognized his younger self accepting an award from the mayor. Where did you get this? Public records, professional journals, court filings. Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. Calvin, you weren't just any construction foreman. You were an innovator, a leader, someone whose safety protocols saved countless lives. That was a long time ago. Not so long that the standards you developed aren't still being used today. Patricia pulled out more documents. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of what I found in your workers' compensation case files. Calvin's hands stilled on the wooden elephant. I don't want to rehash old legal battles. That's all behind me now. Is it? Or has it been with you every day for the past 3 years, convincing you that somehow you deserved what happened to you? The words hit Calvin like a physical blow. He set down his carving tools and looked directly at Patricia for the first time. What did you find? Patricia spent the next hour walking Calvin through the evidence she'd uncovered, the falsified maintenance records, the internal memos revealing corporate strategy, the deliberate campaign to destroy his credibility. With each document, Calvin's expression grew more stunned, more angry, more heartbroken. They knew, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The crane was defective, and they knew it. They knew. And when you were injured, saving your crew, they decided you were a liability to be eliminated rather than a hero to be honored. Calvin stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the courthouse steps. Sarah left because she thought I was throwing our lives away, fighting a hopeless battle. Jenny blamed me for not being able to fix everything. I blame myself for not being stronger, smarter, more persistent. You were fighting a battle you couldn't win because the other side was cheating, Patricia said. They had unlimited resources, teams of lawyers, and no scruples about destroying an innocent man to protect their profits. Calvin turned back to her, and Patricia saw decades of suppressed anger and grief in his eyes. What am I supposed to do with this information? It doesn't change where I am now. It doesn't bring back my family or my house or my career. No. But it might give you the chance to ensure this never happens to anyone else, and it might provide you with resources to build a different future. Patricia explained the legal options. Fraud. Claims weren't subject to the same statute of limitations as standard workplace injuries. The non-disclosure agreement Calvin had signed might be voidable if it was obtained through fraudulent concealment of material facts. There were multiple grounds for legal action, and given the company's documented pattern of misconduct, there was a good chance of significant damages. "I've already spoken with Marcus about representing you," Patricia continued. "Pro bono of course. We have connections with other attorneys who specialize in corporate fraud cases. You wouldn't be fighting this alone." Calvin sat back down heavily, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was proposing. "I can't afford a legal battle. I can't afford anything." "You wouldn't need to. These cases can be pursued on a contingency basis. The attorneys only get paid. If you win, and Calvin, based on what I've seen, you have an extremely strong case." For a long moment they sat in silence. Calvin picked up the wooden elephant and turned it over in his hands, thinking of Ava's delight in his simple carvings, of the way she saw him as someone valuable despite his circumstances. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why are you doing this for me?" Patricia considered the question seriously. "Partly because you saved my granddaughter, and I believe in repaying debts. Partly because I've spent 30 years in the legal system, and I know injustice when I see it. But mostly because I believe you deserve to know the truth about what happened to you, and you deserve the chance to decide what to do with that truth. And if I decide I don't want to fight, if I'd rather leave the past buried, then we respect that decision and never mention this again. But Calvin, I need you to understand something. You're not the only person this company destroyed. The documents suggest a pattern of behavior that may have harmed dozens of workers over the years. Your case could be the key to preventing future victims." Calvin thought of his former crew members, good men with families who deserved safe working conditions and honest treatment. He thought of other construction workers still laboring under unsafe conditions because companies like Meridian valued profits over human lives. How long would it take? Months, possibly a year or more. Corporate fraud cases are complex, and companies like Meridian will fight aggressively to avoid accountability. And during that time, I'd still be— Calvin gestured to his shopping cart, his makeshift existence, not necessarily. Patricia pulled out another document. "I've been in touch with several advocacy organizations that provide housing and support services for people pursuing legal remedies for workplace injuries. There are resources available to ensure you have stability during the legal process." Calvin studied her face, looking for signs of pity or condescension. Instead, he saw determination and respect, the expression of someone who believed he was worth fighting for. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Calvin, I want you to consider something. You've spent 3 years believing you were a failure, that you deserved your circumstances because you weren't strong enough or smart enough to overcome them. Now you know that's not true. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" As Patricia prepared to leave, Calvin called after her. "Why did you really research my background? What made you look deeper?" Patricia paused at the top of the courthouse steps, silhouetted against the building Calvin had helped create. "Because Ava asked me a question I couldn't answer. She wanted to know why good people like you end up with nowhere to live while meanie people get to live in big houses. I realized I'd been accepting injustice as inevitable instead of fighting to understand its causes." "And what did you tell her?" "That sometimes the system fails good people, but that doesn't mean we stop believing in good people, and that sometimes, when we're lucky, we get the chance to make things right." That evening, Calvin sat in his usual spot under the loading dock overhang, staring at the folder of documents Patricia had left with him. The rain had started again, a gentle precipitation that reminded him of the morning he'd found Ava. He pulled out Ava's drawing, now worn from being folded and unfolded so many times. "My guardian angel," It still read in her careful block letters. He'd kept it in his jacket pocket for weeks, a talisman against despair. Now, holding the evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed his life, Calvin began to see a different possibility. Maybe he wasn't just someone who helped others when they needed it. Maybe he was someone who could fight back against the systems that crushed people like him. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop accepting injustice as inevitable and start believing he deserved something better. Calvin reached for his ancient phone and dialed the number Patricia had given him. "Marcus, it's Calvin Murphy. I've been thinking about what your mother-in-law told me today." He paused, watching raindrops gather on the windowsill above him. "I want to fight this. Not just for me, but for everyone they've hurt." On the other end of the line, Marcus Thompson smiled and reached for a legal pad. "Then let's get started." The next morning, Calvin found himself in Marcus's downtown law office, a gleaming space on the 15th floor of a building he'd helped construct 8 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sat in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the streets where he'd spent the last 3 years invisible. Marcus had assembled a team. Linda Chen, a specialist in corporate fraud cases, had driven up from the state capitol. Robert Martinez, an investigator who'd worked the original Meridian construction scandal, joined by conference call from Chicago. And Patricia sat at the head of the table, no longer just a concerned citizen, but a strategic advisor with decades of legal experience. "The good news," Linda said, spreading documents across the conference table, "is that your case fits perfectly into the pattern we've been tracking. Meridian used identical tactics against at least 15 other injured workers between 2005 and 2010. The better news," Robert added via speakerphone, "is that we now have access to internal communications that weren't available during your original case. Email servers, backup files, recorded phone calls. The digital paper trail is extensive." Calvin listened as they outlined their strategy. It wasn't just about his individual case anymore. They were building a comprehensive lawsuit that would expose Meridian's systematic misconduct and potentially recover damages for multiple victims. "I have to warn you," Linda continued, "this won't be easy. Meridian will throw everything they have at discrediting you personally. They'll drag your homelessness into the narrative, suggest that your circumstances prove you were always unreliable." "Let them try," Calvin said quietly. "I'm not the same man who signed that settlement 3 years ago. I know who I am now." Over. The following weeks, Calvin's life took on a structure he hadn't experienced since his construction days. He had appointments with lawyers, meetings with social workers, interviews with investigators. The advocacy organization Patricia had contacted provided him with temporary housing, a small studio apartment that felt luxurious after 3 years on the streets. But the most significant change was internal. For the first time since his accident, Calvin wasn't just surviving, he was fighting back. The media attention started small. A local reporter picked up the story of a homeless man taking on a major construction company. But as details emerged about Meridian's systematic fraud, interest grew. Calvin found himself interviewed by newspapers, radio stations, and eventually television news programs. The hardest part, he told a reporter from the city's main daily newspaper, wasn't losing my house or my job. It was losing my sense that I mattered, that my life had value. When a company destroys your reputation and convinces everyone, including yourself, that you're worthless, that's a special kind of cruelty." The story resonated. Other Meridian victims began coming forward. Construction workers from across the state contacted Marcus's office with similar experiences. The individual case was becoming a class action lawsuit with potentially massive implications, but the personal costs were significant. Calvin's estranged daughter, Jenny, called after seeing him on the evening news. "Dad? What the hell is going on? Mom called me crying, saying you're on TV talking about our family." Calvin closed his eyes. hearing his daughter's voice for the first time in over a year. "I'm trying to make things right, Jenny. I'm fighting the company that destroyed our family." "Our family destroyed our family, Dad. You destroyed our family by never knowing when to quit fighting battles you couldn't win." The words stung because they carried echoes of his own fears. "Maybe you're right, but this time I'm not fighting alone. And this time I have proof." The conversation ended badly, as most of their conversations did, but for the first time, Calvin didn't spend the rest of the day wondering if she was right. He knew the difference between a fight worth winning and a fight that could be won. 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Meridian's attorneys requested a settlement conference. Calvin sat in another conference room, this time in a neutral location, facing the team of corporate lawyers who had orchestrated his downfall. The lead attorney was a woman about Sharon's age, impeccably dressed and professionally detached. "Mr. Murphy, my clients are prepared to offer a substantial settlement to resolve this matter quickly and quietly." "How substantial?" Marcus asked. $2 million, plus guaranteed employment assistance and housing support, in exchange for complete confidentiality and release of all claims. Calvin looked around the table at his legal team, then back at the corporate attorneys. $2 million would solve every practical problem in his life. It would provide security, comfort, the chance to reconnect with his family from a position of strength rather than desperation. "What about the other workers?" he asked. "What about making sure this never happens again?" "That's not part of this settlement offer," the attorney replied crisply. Calvin stood up slowly, thinking of old Pete still working his corner, of Martha still sleeping behind the flower shop, of all the construction workers still laboring under unsafe conditions because companies like Meridian faced no meaningful consequences for their misconduct. "Thank you for the offer," he said formally, "but I'll see you in court." As they left the settlement conference, Marcus put a hand on Calvin's shoulder. "Are you sure about this? $2 million is life-changing money." Calvin thought of Ava's drawing, still folded in his wallet. "Some things are worth more than money. Sometimes you have to fight, not because you're sure you'll win, but because the fight itself has meaning." Walking back through downtown toward his temporary apartment, Calvin passed the courthouse steps where everything had started. The building he'd helped construct rose above him, solid and permanent, a testament to the value of building things that would last. Tomorrow he would enter those halls not as an invisible man seeking shelter, but as someone demanding justice, not just for himself, but for everyone the system had failed. The foundation he'd helped pour 15 years ago would hold. The question now was whether the foundations of justice would prove equally strong. The federal courthouse was packed on the morning Calvin Murphy vs. Meridian Construction Company went to trial. Calvin sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a navy blue suit, the first he'd owned in 3 years, that Patricia had insisted on buying for him. His work boots, polished to a mirror shine, felt strange on his feet after so long in worn sneakers. "Nervous?" Marcus whispered. As the judge entered the courtroom, Calvin touched the folded drawing in his jacket pocket. Ava's crayon masterpiece had become his good luck charm. "No, ready." Judge William Harrison called the court to order, and Calvin felt a surreal moment of recognition. He'd poured the concrete for the foundation of this very courtroom 15 years earlier. Now he sat here, seeking justice from the system he'd helped build with his own hands. Marcus stood to deliver his opening statement, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about more than workplace injury compensation. It's about corporate greed so profound that a company was willing to knowingly endanger workers' lives, then systematically destroy those workers when they were injured by that negligence." Calvin watched the 12 jurors, construction workers, teachers, retirees, small business owners, as Marcus laid out the evidence. Internal memos showing Meridian knew about crane defects months before Calvin's accident. Maintenance records, that had been falsified to hide safety violations. Email chains detailing the strategy to neutralize Calvin's compensation claim through character assassination. Calvin Murphy wasn't just any employee, Marcus continued. He was their most experienced foreman, their safety innovator, the man they called when projects required someone they could trust absolutely. When he pushed two younger workers out of the way of a falling beam, he was doing exactly what Meridian had trained him to do, protect his crew at any cost. Meridian's lead attorney, Janet Richards, rose for her opening statement with the confidence of someone representing deep pockets and powerful interests. Mr. Murphy's current circumstances are unfortunate, but they don't change the facts of his case, she said coolly. He received fair compensation for his workplace injury according to the settlement he willingly accepted. What's happened to him since? His homelessness, his family problems, those are personal issues, not corporate. Liability. Calvin felt the familiar sting of having his life reduced to personal issues, but this time he had allies. This time he had proof. The first day of testimony focused on the technical aspects of the crane failure. Expert witnesses explained how deferred maintenance had created the conditions for the accident. Engineering reports detailed the specific defects that Meridian had known about but failed to address. But it was Robert Martinez, the investigator, who delivered the most damaging evidence. Taking the stand on the second day, he walked the jury through the digital paper trail that revealed Meridian's deliberate strategy. This email from the company's legal department is dated 5 days after Mr. Murphy's accident, Robert said, reading from a document displayed on the courtroom's projection screen. It says Murphy incident creates significant liability exposure. Recommend aggressive defense posture to discourage similar claims from other workers. The jury stirred. This wasn't about workplace safety anymore. It was about corporate intimidation. Did the company's strategy work? Marcus asked during direct examination. Absolutely. Internal communications show that workplace injury claims dropped by 68% in the 2 years following Mr. Murphy's case. Workers were afraid to report injuries because they'd seen what happened to someone who tried to seek compensation. Janet Richards fought back during cross-examination, trying to paint Robert as a biased investigator with an axe to grind against Meridian. But the documents spoke for themselves. On the third day, it was Calvin's turn to testify. Walking to the witness stand, Calvin felt the weight of 3 years of humiliation and despair, but also the strength of knowing the truth. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Marcus began with Calvin's background, his rise from day laborer to respected foreman, his safety innovations, his 15 years of exemplary service. The jury saw photographs of buildings Calvin had constructed, read testimonials from workers whose lives his protocols had saved. Tell us about the day of your accident, Marcus said gently. Calvin took a breath, remembering that moment when everything changed. The crane was lifting a steel beam to the 5th floor. I heard this grinding noise, metal on metal, that didn't sound right. I looked up and saw the cable was starting to fray. What did you do? I yelled for everyone to clear the area. Most of the crew heard me and moved back, but 2 of the younger guys, Tommy Chen and David Rodriguez, were right in the fall zone, focused on their work. The beam was already coming down. So you pushed them to safety? I didn't think about it. You see someone in danger, you help them. That's what you do. Calvin's voice remained steady as he described the crushing blow to his back, the months of pain and medical uncertainty, the slow realization that his career was over. But his voice broke when Marcus asked about the legal battle that followed. They made me feel like a criminal for getting hurt, like I was trying to cheat them out of money I didn't deserve. Every meeting with their lawyers, every deposition, every medical examination, they treated me like I was lying about my pain, lying about my disability. How did that affect you? Calvin looked out at the packed courtroom, seeing Patricia and Sharon and Ava in the front row. It made me believe I was worthless, that everything that happened afterward, losing my house, my family, ending up on the streets, was somehow my fault. Janet Richards approached Calvin for cross-examination like a predator sensing weakness. She had studied his case file for months, looking for vulnerabilities she could exploit. "Mr. Murphy, you've been homeless for 3 years. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And during that time you've struggled with depression." Marcus started to object, but Calvin held up his hand. "Yes, I have." "Have you received any mental health treatment?" "I couldn't afford it." "Have you used alcohol or drugs to cope with your circumstances?" Calvin met her gaze steadily. "I've had drinks. I've never used illegal drugs." Richards pulled out a stack of photographs. "These were taken by private investigators during your original workers' compensation case. They show you lifting objects, walking without assistance, engaging in physical activities that contradicted your claims of disability." Calvin looked at the photos. Images of him carrying grocery bags, helping Jenny move furniture, playing catch with his neighbor's dog. Normal activities that Meridian's lawyers had twisted into evidence of fraud. "Mr. Murphy, if you were as disabled as you claimed, how do you explain these activities?" "Because living with chronic pain doesn't mean you stop living," Calvin replied, his voice gaining strength. "It means you do what you have to do, even when it hurts, even when you pay for it later." "But you were seeking compensation for total disability." "I was seeking compensation for not being able to do the job I'd trained my whole life to do." "There's a difference between carrying groceries and operating heavy machinery on a construction site." Richards shifted tactics. "Your family left you during this period. Your wife moved to Arizona. Your daughter stopped speaking to you. Doesn't that suggest the problem was with your behavior, not the company's treatment of you?" The question hit Calvin like a physical blow, but he'd prepared for this moment. "My family left because the stress of fighting Meridian's lies was destroying all of us," he said quietly. "Sarah worked double shifts while I attended depositions and medical appointments. Jenny's addiction got worse while we spent our savings on legal fees. The company didn't just steal my career, they systematically destroyed everything I cared about to protect their bottom line. You could have accepted their settlement offer earlier. I could have accepted their lie that I was somehow responsible for an accident caused by their negligence. But I believed the system would recognize the truth. I was wrong." Richard sensed she was losing ground. "Mr. Murphy, isn't it true that you signed the settlement agreement willingly, that you were represented by counsel and fully understood the terms?" Calvin looked directly at the jury. "I signed it because my family was falling apart. My daughter was in jail, and I couldn't afford to keep fighting. But I didn't know then what I know now, that they had been lying from the beginning." "What lies specifically?" Marcus stood. "Objection. Asked and answered. The fraudulent concealment has been thoroughly established through documentary evidence." Sustained. Richards made one final attempt to discredit Calvin. "Mr. Murphy, you're asking this jury to award you millions of dollars in damages. Given your current circumstances, how do we know you won't simply waste this money on—" "Objection!" Marcus's voice cut across the courtroom. "Counsel is clearly attempting to prejudice the jury based on the plaintiff's economic status." Sustained. The jury will disregard counsel's question, but Calvin was already answering. "You don't know what I'll do with any award from this jury, but I can tell you what I won't do. I won't use it to cover up corporate crimes that endanger other workers. I won't use it to buy silence about a company that destroys people's lives for profit." He paused, looking directly at each juror. 3 months ago, I was invisible. I slept under a loading dock and survived on the kindness of strangers. But I still stopped to help a little girl who needed me, because that's who I am. That's who I've always been, even when the world convinced me otherwise. When Richards finished her cross-examination, Marcus had one final question on redirect. "Mr. Murphy, why are you pursuing this case?" Calvin thought of Ava. of Patricia's research, of all the workers still laboring under unsafe conditions because companies like Meridian faced no real consequences for their misconduct. Because the truth matters. Because justice matters. Because maybe if we hold them accountable, the next worker who gets hurt won't have to choose between his family and fighting for what's right. After Calvin stepped down, Marcus called his final witness, Tommy Chen, one of the workers Calvin had saved during the crane accident. Tommy was now a project manager for a rival construction company. He spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed both heroism and injustice. Calvin Murphy saved my life, he testified, not just that day when he pushed me out of the way, but every day I worked under his supervision. His safety protocols, his attention to detail, his insistence that every worker go home safe. That's why I'm alive to testify today. What happened to Mr. Murphy after his injury? The company tried to erase him. They removed his name from safety, manuals he'd written. They stopped using protocols he'd developed. They acted like 15 years of service meant nothing because he'd had the audacity to get hurt protecting his crew. In her closing argument, Janet Richards made one final attempt to minimize Calvin's suffering and Meridian's culpability. But her words rang hollow against the weight of evidence. Marcus's closing was simple and powerful. Calvin Murphy built this courthouse with his own hands. Now he's asking you to use it to deliver justice, not just for him, but for every worker who deserves to be treated with dignity when they're injured protecting their colleagues. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood to deliver their verdict. In the matter of Calvin Murphy versus Meridian Construction Company, we find for the plaintiff on all counts. 6 months after the jury awarded Calvin Murphy $4.2 million in compensatory and punitive damages, he stood in the kitchen of his small but comfortable apartment, preparing Sunday dinner for the Hamilton family. The apartment wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms in a renovated warehouse district, but it had something Calvin hadn't experienced in years. It was home. The keys to this place sat on his kitchen counter in a small wooden bowl Ava had carved for him during one of their woodworking sessions. Simple brass keys, nothing special to look at, but they represented security, belonging, and the radical concept that Calvin Murphy was someone worthy of having a permanent address. "Mr. Calvin, the potatoes are ready," Ava called from the living room, where she was setting the table with the careful precision of a 10-year-old who took her responsibilities seriously. "Thank you, sweetheart. Can you ask your grandmother to open the wine?" It had taken months to establish this routine. Sunday. Dinners that rotated between Calvin's apartment and the Hamilton family home. At first, Calvin had been overwhelmed by the generosity, uncertain how to navigate the social dynamics of a family that had welcomed him not as a charity case, but as an equal. Patricia emerged from the living room carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the slightly bewildered expression she got whenever she tried to understand Calvin's kitchen organization system. "I still can't believe you alphabetize your spice rack," she said, settling into a chair at the small dining table. 15 years of construction sites teaches you the value of keeping things organized," Calvin replied, carrying a pot roast to the table that filled the apartment with rich, savory aromas. Marcus and Sharon arrived as he was carving the meat, bringing dessert and the easy conversation that had become natural between them over the past months. These weren't the stilted interactions of people from different social worlds anymore. They were the comfortable exchanges of chosen family. "Any word from the appeals court?" Marcus asked as they settled around the table. "Last week, Meridian's final appeal was denied. The judgment is final." Sharon raised her wine glass. "To justice finally served." "To justice," they echoed, but Calvin noticed how the word had evolved in meaning over their months together. It wasn't just about legal vindication anymore. It was about the restoration of dignity, the rebuilding of community, the recognition that everyone deserved a chance at redemption. The money from the settlement had changed Calvin's life in practical ways, but not in the ways most people might expect. He hadn't bought expensive cars or moved to an exclusive neighborhood. Instead, he had used his resources to create something lasting. The Calvin Murphy Center for Worker Advocacy occupied a small office building downtown, just 3 blocks from the courthouse steps where he'd found Ava. The center provided legal assistance, housing support, and job training for workers injured on construction sites. The kinds of comprehensive services Calvin had needed but couldn't access during his own crisis. "We had 12 new clients this week," Calvin reported as they ate. 2 workplace injury cases, 3 housing assistance requests, and 7 people who just needed someone to help them navigate the workers' compensation system. "Any interesting cases?" Patricia asked. As the center's volunteer legal advisor, she had discovered a second career in advocacy work that energized her more than her previous judicial duties. A crane operator from the Riverside Project. "Sound familiar?" Calvin's voice carried grim satisfaction. Same company, same pattern of negligence, same attempt to blame the worker for reporting safety violations. "What's different this time?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. This time, they're not fighting alone. The center had become more than Calvin had envisioned when he'd first conceived it. Word had spread through the construction community about a place where injured workers could get real help without judgment, where their experiences would be believed, where someone understood the unique challenges of rebuilding a life after everything fell apart. Old Pete had been one of their first success stories. It turned out his veteran status qualified him for housing benefits he'd never known existed. Martha now worked part-time at the center, using her years of street wisdom to help newly homeless individuals navigate the complex social services system. "Speaking of the center," Sharon said, "Ava has something to show you." Ava practically bounced in her chair as she pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "I wrote an essay for school about heroes, and Mrs. Patterson said it was so good she's going to submit it to the district writing contest." She handed Calvin a typed page titled, "My Guardian Angel Teaches Me About Justice." Calvin read silently, his throat tightening as he absorbed Ava's perspective on their relationship and the lessons she'd learned from watching his journey from despair to advocacy. "She wrote about how you taught her that being a hero isn't about being perfect," Sharon explained softly. "It's about choosing to help people even when you're struggling yourself." Calvin folded the essay carefully. Another treasure to join, Ava's original drawing in his collection of reminders about what mattered most. The spelling was better now, but the heart was the same. "I'm very proud of you," he told Ava seriously. "This is beautiful writing. Will you help me practice reading it, in case I have to present it to the judges?" "Of course." As the evening wound down and the Hamilton family prepared to leave, Patricia pulled Calvin aside for a private conversation. "I've been thinking about expansion," she said. "The center is getting requests from other cities, workers who've heard about what we're doing here. What would you think about franchising the model?" Calvin looked around his modest apartment, at the photographs of the family he'd chosen, at the certificates of appreciation from grateful clients, at the simple evidence of a life rebuilt with purpose and dignity. "I think," he said slowly, "that maybe it's time to build something bigger than either of us originally imagined." Later, after his guests had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, Calvin sat in his living room with the newspaper article that had appeared that morning. The headline read, "From Homeless to Helping, Construction Workers' Legal Victory Sparks Statewide Reform Movement." But it wasn't the headline that had caught his attention, it was the photograph. There he stood outside the Worker Advocacy Center, surrounded by clients and volunteers, his face showing the calm confidence of someone who had found his true calling. Beside him in the photo stood Ava, now 11 and taller than when he'd first found her on those courthouse steps. She was holding a sign for the center's new literacy program, an initiative that taught basic reading and writing skills to adults who had never had the opportunity for formal education. Calvin touched the keys in the wooden bowl, remembering the day 3 years ago when he'd awakened on cardboard beneath a loading dock, convinced his life was over. He thought about the rainy morning when he'd chosen to help a child in need, not knowing that decision would lead to the recovery of everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. Sometimes salvation came disguised as the chance to save someone else. Sometimes the foundation you needed most was built from the simple decision to keep caring about others, even when the world had stopped caring about you. Calvin turned off the lights and headed toward his bedroom, past the kitchen table where tomorrow's breakfast would be eaten, past the bookshelf filled with legal texts and children's stories, past the small wooden birds that reminded him daily of the beauty that could be created from scraps. In the darkness, he whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for his changed circumstances, but for the reminder that dignity and worth were not things that could be taken away by circumstances or corporations or even well-meaning judges. They were things that lived inside a person, waiting patiently for the right moment to emerge and change the world.